They laughed when he followed her out, but by sunrise, no one in that town would dare speak her name the same way again. The sound of boots against Old Saloon would always carried farther than it should, like the building itself wanted to remember who walked through it. And that night, every step Caleb Thorne took behind Eleanor Whitaker echoed just a little too loud, just a little too deliberate, cutting through the low hum of drunken laughter and half-finished card games. She didn't stop when she heard him, didn't turn, didn't even slow her pace as she pushed open the swinging door and stepped into the cool desert night where the wind smelled like dust and distant rain, but the laughter followed them out anyway, spilling into the street in sharp bursts that faded only when the door creaked shut behind them. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the fabric worn thin from years of use, and kept walking down the narrow stretch of dirt road that led away from the glow of lanterns and into the darker edge of town where buildings leaned a little more and people asked fewer questions. Caleb stayed a few steps behind, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to be mistaken for anything but what he was, a man choosing to follow. "You should go back," she said finally, her voice steady but tired in a way that didn't belong to just one night, and he could hear it without needing to see her face, the kind of tired that came from being overlooked so many times it stopped surprising you. He didn't answer right away. Just let the wind fill the space between them. Let the creak of a loose sign somewhere down the street speak first. And when he did speak, his voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the dark. "I don't go where I'm told unless it makes sense," which earned him nothing but a small shake of her head, barely visible in the dim light. They walked another 20 yards before her house came into view, a small structure set slightly apart from the others, its paint long faded. Its porch slanted just enough to make a stranger hesitate before stepping onto it. But Caleb didn't hesitate. Not when she climbed the steps, not when she paused at the door with her hand resting on the handle like she was deciding something heavier than whether to let him in. "Don't mistake this," she said without turning. "I'm not someone you fix by being kind for a night." And there it was, not anger, not bitterness, just a statement worn smooth by repetition, like she'd said it before to men who thought kindness was something you could hand out like spare change. Caleb reached up, took his hat off, and held it in his hand instead of putting it back on, a small gesture, easy to miss if. "You weren't looking for it. I'm not here to fix anything," he said. And that was all, no promise, no explanation, just the truth as far as he knew it. The door opened with a soft groan, and the inside of the house greeted them with the faint scent of old wood and something warmer underneath, something like coffee grounds long since cooled. Eleanor stepped in first, moving with the familiarity of someone who had memorized every inch of the space, every creak in the floorboards, every place the wind found its way through, and Caleb followed, ducking his head slightly out of habit even though the doorway was tall enough. She crossed the room to a small table and struck a match, the brief flare of light casting sharp shadows across her face before settling into the steady glow of a lantern. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out, not uncomfortable, just heavy with things unsaid. "Storm's coming," she murmured, more to the room than to him, as the wind picked up outside, rattling the loose edge of a window frame. And Caleb nodded, though she wasn't looking at him. "That's what they said back in town," he replied, setting his hat down on the back of a chair, instead of keeping it in his hands like he had been, like he was deciding, in that small motion, that he wasn't leaving any time soon. Eleanor turned then, really looked at him for the first time since they'd left the saloon, her eyes sharp despite the lines that framed them, measuring, weighing, trying to understand what kind of man followed an old woman home while a whole room laughed behind him. "You don't even know my name," she said, not accusing, just stating another fact. "Eleanor Whitaker," he answered without hesitation. And that caught her off guard, just enough to show, in the slight tightening of her jaw. "People talk," he added, and she let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "They do," she agreed, turning back to the lantern, adjusting the wick until the flame steadied. Outside, the first low roll of thunder moved across the sky, distant but certain, and inside, Caleb leaned against the wall near the door, not sitting, not settling in fully, just staying, as if the act of remaining exactly where he was carried more meaning than any explanation he could offer. And Eleanor, after a long moment, reached for a second cup from the shelf, setting it beside the first without comment, as though she had already made her decision long before he ever stepped through the door. The wind pressed harder against the walls as the storm finally arrived, not with fury, but with a steady insistence that made the whole house feel like it was breathing slow and deep. Eleanor moved carefully around the small kitchen, her hands knowing where everything belonged even in the low lantern light. She poured water into a kettle that had seen better years and set it over the small iron stove, the metal ticking softly as it warmed. Caleb remained where he was for a while, back against the wall, eyes tracing the room without staring at anything too long, a habit built from years on the road where noticing too much too quickly could be mistaken for something else. "You always let strangers walk in when it storms," he said after a minute, his voice even, not accusing, just placing a thought into the air. Eleanor did not look at him. "No," she answered, simple and final. Then after a pause that stretched just enough to mean something, "But storms do not ask permission either." The kettle began to hum, a low sound that filled the space between them, and Caleb pushed himself off the wall, stepping closer but still keeping a respectful distance, about 6 feet, enough to show he understood boundaries, even if he did not fully explain why he crossed them. "Then I suppose I got lucky," he said, and she almost smiled, not quite enough to be seen, but enough to change the shape of her face for a heartbeat. She reached for 2 cups, chipped, but clean, and poured the hot water over a small handful of dried leaves, the scent rising gentle and familiar, something like sage and something older. "It is not luck," she said quietly, handing 1 cup toward him without meeting his eyes. "It is timing, and timing has a way of costing people more than they expect." Caleb accepted the cup with a slight nod, his fingers brushing the warm ceramic. Grounding, he took a sip and let the silence return, not rushing to fill it, not trying to turn the moment into something it was not outside. The rain began, soft at first, then steadier, tapping against the roof in a rhythm that felt almost like a memory. Eleanor sat down in the chair by the table, her posture straight despite the years that had tried to bend it, and for a while they simply listened, 2 people sharing the same space without needing to claim it. "Why did you follow me?" she asked eventually, not looking at him, her gaze fixed on the flame inside the lantern. Caleb leaned one shoulder against the edge of the table, not sitting, still not settling fully. "Because no one else did," he answered, and that hung there, heavier than it sounded. Eleanor let out a breath through her nose, slow, controlled. "That is not a reason," she said, but her voice had softened, just enough. "It is tonight," he replied, and for the first time, she turned her head slightly toward him, studying his face like she was trying to decide if he understood the weight of what he had said. The storm outside grew louder, the rain now steady enough to blur the world beyond the small windows, making the house feel even more isolated, like it existed outside of the town entirely. "People in that saloon," she began, choosing her words carefully, "they think they know me." Caleb did not interrupt, did not nod, did not offer agreement. He just listened, the way a man does when he knows the next words matter more than anything he could say. "They think I stayed too long in a place that moved on without me," she continued, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup in her hands. "They think I am what is left when a life ends quietly." The lantern flickered as a gust of wind slipped through a crack somewhere, and Caleb shifted his weight, just a fraction, as if anchoring himself to the moment. "And what do you think?" he asked, not pushing, just opening a door. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, long enough that the question could have been ignored, but she did not ignore it. "I think," she said slowly, "that people stopped asking me that question years ago, and there was not sadness, not anger, just a truth laid bare." Caleb lowered his gaze for a second, then lifted it again, steady. "Then I guess I am late," he said, and that earned him a real reaction, not big, not loud, but real, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in something closer to curiosity, like she was seeing a shape she did not recognize. "Late for what?" she asked, and he took a breath, not deep, just enough to choose his words. "For listening," he said, simple, unadorned, and the room seemed to settle around that. The storm outside continuing its steady rhythm, the kettle cooling on the stove, the lantern casting long shadows that moved with the flame. Eleanor leaned back slightly in her chair, her grip on the cup loosening. "Listening does not change anything," she said almost to herself, and Caleb did not argue, did not try to convince her otherwise. "No," he agreed quietly, "but sometimes it stops things from being taken." That made her look at him again, sharper this time, as if that sentence carried more weight than it should have, as if it brushed against something she had not said out loud. "Taken," she repeated, and the word lingered, fragile but important. Caleb did not elaborate, did not reach into his coat with a folded paper rested against his chest, did not give away what sat between them unseen. He simply stood there, cup in hand, as the storm pressed on and the night stretched longer, and for the first time in years, Eleanor Whitaker found herself sitting across from someone who did not speak over her silence, who did not fill the room with assumptions, who did not treat her like something that had already passed, and she did not know yet what that meant, only that it felt unfamiliar, and unfamiliar, out here, could be the most dangerous thing of all. The rain settled into a steady rhythm that blurred time itself, each drop tapping the roof like a quiet insistence that the world outside could wait. Eleanor did not move for a while, her gaze resting somewhere past the lantern flame, somewhere deeper than the room, and Caleb, still standing, still not claiming a chair, watched the way her fingers traced the edge of the cup without realizing it, a small motion, repetitive, like someone holding on to a thought they had not decided to speak. "You talk like a man who has already made up his mind," she said at last, her voice low, almost blending with the sound of the rain. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, the wooden floor giving a soft creak beneath his boots. "Not about everything," he answered, and there was something honest in that, something unfinished. Eleanor let out a quiet breath, not quite a sigh. "Men who come through this town usually know exactly what they want," she continued, her eyes finally lifting to meet his. "And it is rarely something they are willing to say out loud." Caleb held her gaze, steady, unflinching. "That is because most of them are here to take something," he said, and the words settled between them again. Heavier now, Eleanor's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in suspicion, but in recognition. "And you are not?" she asked, not fully a question, more like a test. Caleb did not answer right away. He reached down, set his cup carefully on the table, the ceramic touching wood with a soft, deliberate sound. "I was," he said finally, and that changed the air in the room, not sharply, not violently, but enough that it could be felt, like a shift in pressure before a storm deepens. Eleanor did not speak, did not move. She simply waited, the way someone learns to wait when they have spent years being told only parts of the truth. "This town," Caleb continued, his voice even, measured, "it is growing faster than it should." Eleanor gave a faint nod. "Growth has a way of ignoring who it steps on," she replied. Caleb glanced toward the small window where the rain streaked down the glass in uneven lines. "There are men who want land," he said, "not for living, not for building homes, but for what comes after." Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around her cup again, and mine sits just far enough outside their reach to be inconvenient, she finished for him, and there was no surprise in her tone, only confirmation. Caleb looked back at her. "Yes," he said, "simple," and the honesty in that single word carried more weight than anything he could have dressed it with. The lantern flickered again, casting shadows that stretched and pulled across the walls like memories trying to take shape. "So you followed me because of that," Eleanor said, her voice steady again, controlled, but something underneath it had shifted, something quieter, more guarded. Caleb shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "I came to this town because of that." He paused, just long enough for the distinction to settle. "I followed you because of something else." Eleanor leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him now with a sharper focus. "You expect me to believe that?" she asked, not mocking, not dismissing, just careful. Caleb met her gaze without hesitation. "No," he answered, and that caught her again, just enough to break the rhythm she had built around herself. "I expect you to decide what you believe," he added, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the rain filling the silence once more, steady, patient outside. The storm showed no sign of passing, and inside, the air felt heavier, not uncomfortable, but charged with something unspoken. Eleanor set her cup down slowly, her hands now resting flat against the table as if grounding herself in something solid. "There was a time," she said quietly, "when men came to my door with offers." Caleb did not interrupt. "They spoke politely," she continued. "Used words like opportunity and progress, as if those things could replace what they were asking me to give up." Her voice did not rise, did not break. It remained calm, measured, which somehow made it carry further. "And when I said no," she added, "they stopped asking." Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in understanding. "They usually do," he said, and Eleanor gave a small nod. "After that, the town changed," she went on. "People stopped seeing me, not all at once, not in any way you could point to, just gradually." She gestured lightly toward the direction of the saloon. "Until tonight, I was not even worth laughing at." The words settled softly, but their weight lingered. Caleb looked down for a moment, then back up. "They laughed," he said, "because they think they already know how your story ends." Eleanor's lips pressed together briefly. "And you do not?" she asked. Caleb shook his head. "No," he said. "I think stories only end when someone decides they are finished." And that hung there, quiet but firm. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, longer than before, as if measuring not just his words but the space between them. "And what do you decide?" she asked finally. Caleb glanced toward the stove, with a faint glow of embers remained, then back at her. "I decide what I walk away from," he said, and there was again that hint of something unspoken, something resting just beneath the surface. Eleanor followed his gaze for a second, then returned to his face. "And were you not walking away from tonight?" she asked, softer now, not challenging, just searching. Caleb did not answer immediately, the storm outside pressing closer, the lantern flickering in response. He reached into his coat, slightly, just enough to feel the folded paper still there, still waiting, then let his hand fall back to his side. "This," he said simply, and though he did not point, did not define it, the word filled the room all the same, and Eleanor, for the first time in years, did not look away from it. The word lingered between them like something fragile that neither of them wanted to touch too quickly. The storm outside pressing closer, wind slipping through the cracks in the wood and carrying the scent of wet earth into the room. Eleanor did not move at first, her eyes fixed on Caleb, as if she was trying to understand what he meant without forcing him to explain it. And Caleb, for once, did not look away. He held that silence, steady, the kind of silence that was not empty, but full of decisions not yet spoken. "This is a dangerous place to stay," she said after a while, her voice softer now, not warning him, just stating something she had learned long before he arrived. Caleb gave a small nod. "Most places are," he replied, and that was not bravado, not confidence, just experience worn into the way he spoke. Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair, the wood creaking beneath her as she leaned forward just enough to rest her elbows on the table. "You do not understand," she said, and there was no sharpness in it, only certainty. "Men who come for land do not always come alone." Caleb's gaze flickered for a moment, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. "I know," he said, and this time there was something different in his tone, something that carried more weight than before. Eleanor watched him closely, her eyes narrowing just enough to catch the change. "Then you know this is not something you can simply walk away from in the morning," she added. And Caleb exhaled slowly, his breath barely visible in the lantern light. "That depends on what I choose to carry with me," he said. And again, he left it there, unfinished, but not unclear. The rain struck harder now, drumming against the roof in a steady pattern that filled the spaces between their words. Eleanor leaned back again, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table as if grounding herself. "There was a time," she said quietly, "when I believed staying meant something." Caleb did not interrupt, did not nod. He simply listened, the way he had been since the moment he stepped inside. "I thought if I held on long enough, if I kept saying no, things would remain the same," she continued, her gaze drifting toward the window where the storm blurred everything beyond it. "But places like this do not stay the same. They shift slowly until one day you wake up and realize you're the only thing that has not moved." Her voice did not break, but there was a weight in it now. Something carried over years. Caleb stepped a little closer, not enough to invade her space, just enough that he was no longer leaning against the wall. "And yet you stayed," he said, and Eleanor gave a faint nod. "Because it was mine," she answered, simple, direct, the kind of truth that does not need decoration. Caleb's eyes dropped briefly to the floor, then lifted again. "That still matters," he said, and she almost laughed at that, not out of mockery, but out of something closer to disbelief. "To who?" she asked, and the question hung there quiet but heavy. Caleb did not answer immediately, his hand moving again, almost unconsciously, toward the inside of his coat where the folded paper rested, still intact, still waiting. He stopped himself before touching it, his fingers curling slightly instead. "It matters to the person who decides it does," he said finally, and Eleanor studied him again, longer this time, as if trying to see past the words into whatever stood behind them. The lantern flame flickered, casting shifting shadows across his face, making it harder to read. "You speak like a man who has already chosen something," she said, and Caleb did not deny it. He simply stood there, steady. "Maybe I have," he replied, and the air in the room seemed to tighten just a little, not with tension, but with anticipation. Eleanor's gaze moved slowly from his face to the coat he wore, then back again, something in her expression changing. Not suspicion, not fear, but recognition, as if she understood more than he had said. "If you came here for that land," she said carefully, "then staying here tonight does not change what waits for you tomorrow." Caleb's jaw shifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought. "No," he said, "but it might change what I do about it." And that was the closest he had come to revealing anything, the closest he had come to letting the truth step into the room. Eleanor's fingers tightened once more on the table, then slowly relaxed, her shoulders easing just a fraction. "People do not change like that," she said, not dismissing him, just speaking for what she had seen, what she had lived. Caleb gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Most do not," he agreed, and the honesty in that made the next silence feel different, less guarded, less certain. The storm outside began to soften slightly, the rain easing from a heavy drum to a steady whisper, as if the night itself was shifting along with something inside the room. Eleanor reached for her cup again, lifting it but not drinking, just holding it, feeling the warmth that remained. "You should rest," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, not pushing him away, just acknowledging the passing of time. Caleb glanced toward the far corner of the room where a narrow cot sat against the wall, simple, worn, but clean, then back at her. "And you?" he asked, and she gave a small shake of her head. "I've had years to learn how to sit with the night," she answered, and there was no bitterness in it, only truth. Caleb hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded, stepping toward the cot, but not lying down yet, as if he was not ready to fully let go of the moment. Eleanor watched him for a second longer, then turned her gaze back to the lantern, adjusting the wick slightly, the flame steadying once more, and in that quiet, with the storm beginning to fade and the night stretching thinner, something unspoken settled between them. Not agreement, not understanding, but something close enough to both that neither of them felt the need to break it. The night stretched thinner as the storm began to lose its grip on the sky, the steady rain softening into a quiet drizzle that tapped more gently against the roof, like the world outside had decided to step back and listen. Caleb finally sat on the edge of the narrow cot, the wood frame giving a low creak beneath his weight, but he did not lie down, not yet. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his hat still set aside, his coat still on, as if he had not fully allowed himself to arrive. Eleanor remained at the table, the lantern casting a steady glow across her face, her eyes no longer distant but focused, present, watching him in that quiet way she had, measuring not what he said, but what he did not. "You are not sleeping," she said after a while. Not as a question, just an observation shaped into words. Caleb gave a small shake of his head. "Not yet," he replied, his voice low, respectful of the hour. Eleanor nodded once, slowly, as if that confirmed something she already knew. "Men who carry unfinished decisions rarely do," she said, and Caleb's gaze shifted slightly toward her, not surprised, but aware that she had seen more than he had spoken. You notice a lot, he said, and there was no challenge in it, only acknowledgement. Eleanor allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile, one that did not quite reach her eyes but softened them nonetheless. When people stop speaking to you, she answered, you learn to listen to everything else. The words settled into the room with a quiet weight. Caleb leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his thighs, his hands loosely clasped now. And what does everything else say tonight? He asked, not pressing, just opening the space again. Eleanor turned her gaze toward the small window, where the last of the rain traced slow paths down the glass. It says, she began carefully, that you are standing at the edge of something you thought you understood. She paused, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if focusing on something beyond the present moment. And now you are not sure you want it the same way. Caleb let out a slow breath. Not heavy, just enough to acknowledge the truth in her words. That sounds about right, he admitted. And for a moment, the honesty between them felt almost unfamiliar, like something neither of them had expected to find in a place like this. Eleanor shifted in her chair, her hands folding together loosely in front of her. Most men do not stop once they come this far, she said, her voice steady, but quieter now. They tell themselves it is already decided. Caleb nodded faintly. That is the easy way, he said, and she met his eyes again. And the other way, she asked, and Caleb looked down briefly, then back up. Costs more, he answered simply, and neither of them needed to ask what that meant. The room fell into silence again, but it was not the same silence as before. It had changed, grown heavier, more aware, the kind of silence that comes when something important has already begun to take shape. Eleanor leaned back slightly, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer before drifting to the lantern. You remind me of someone, she said suddenly, the words coming without warning. Caleb tilted his head, just a fraction, not questioning, just listening. A long time ago, she continued, before this town started measuring people by what they could give up. Her fingers traced the edge of the table again, that same small, absent motion from earlier. There was a man who came through here, she said. He stayed one night, just like this. Caleb did not move, did not interrupt. His attention fixed on her now, fully. He said something I did not understand at the time, she went on, her voice softening slightly. Not with emotion, but with memory. He said that land does not belong to the one who holds it, but to the one who refuses to let it be taken for the wrong reasons. She paused, her eyes returning to Caleb's face. I thought he was just passing through, she added, but now I think he was deciding something too. Caleb's expression did not change much, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle straightening, a quiet acknowledgement of the weight in her words. What did he decide? He asked, his voice just above a whisper. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment, the lantern light flickering between them. He left, she said finally, and he never came back. The answer settled into the room, not as a disappointment, not as regret, but as a simple fact. Caleb nodded once, slowly. Sometimes leaving is the decision, he said, and Eleanor studied him again, more carefully now, as if trying to see whether he believed that, or whether he was still searching for something else. And sometimes, she replied, staying is the harder one. The words lingered, quiet but firm. Caleb looked toward the stove, where the last of the embers glowed faintly beneath a thin layer of ash, then back at her. I am beginning to think you are right, he said, and there was no hesitation in it now, no uncertainty, just the beginning of something that had not fully formed yet. Eleanor did not respond immediately. She simply watched him, the way she had been all night, but this time there was something different in her expression, something less guarded, less distant, as if she had decided, if only for this moment, to let the silence hold them both without pushing him away. Outside, the storm had nearly passed, the rain reduced to a soft whisper, the air settling into a stillness that felt almost unnatural after hours of movement. And inside that small house, with the lantern burning steady and the night drawing closer to morning, two people sat across from each other, both aware, in their own quiet way, that whatever decision waited beyond that door would not be the same one that had been carried in. The night had thinned into that quiet hour where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The storm now, nothing more than a memory clinging to the damp edges of the world. And inside the small house, the lantern burned lower, its flame steady but softer, like it understood the weight of what had settled between them. Caleb remained seated on the edge of the cot, but now his posture had changed, less guarded, less ready to leave at a moment's notice, as if something in him had begun to root itself in the space without asking permission. Eleanor still sat at the table, though her shoulders had eased, the tension that had held her for so many years loosening just enough to be noticed if one knew where to look. "Morning will come soon," she said quietly, her eyes drifting toward the window where the darkness had begun to fade into something lighter. Not yet dawn, but close enough to feel. Caleb followed her gaze, watching the faint shift in color beyond the glass. "It always does," he replied, and there was something different in his tone now, something that carried more than observation, something closer to acceptance. Eleanor turned her attention back to him, studying him the way she had all night, but this time with less distance, less resistance. And with it, she continued. "People return to what they decided before the night gave them time to think otherwise." Caleb did not answer immediately, his eyes lowering briefly as if tracing a thought he had not yet spoken, then lifting again to meet hers. "Not always," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried a quiet certainty that had not been there before. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in curiosity. "You are certain of that now?" she asked, and Caleb gave a small nod. "More than I was yesterday," he admitted, and the honesty of that admission settled into the room like something solid, something that could not be easily moved. The lantern flickered once, then steadied again, casting a warm glow that softened the edges of everything. "Then the question is not whether you will decide," Eleanor said slowly, her voice measured, deliberate, "but whether you will stand by it when it costs you." Caleb exhaled quietly, the sound barely more than a breath. "It already does," he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no unfinished edge. To his words, Eleanor's eyes sharpened just slightly at that, her attention narrowing fully onto him. "What does it cost you?" she asked, and for the first time, the question carried weight enough to press against him, not forcing, but asking him to step fully into the truth he had been circling all night. Caleb's hand moved again toward his coat, slower this time, more deliberate, his fingers slipping inside and finding the folded paper that had remained hidden, untouched. Waiting, he held it there for a moment, feeling its presence, its weight, before drawing it out into the lantern light, the edges worn from being carried, the fold sharp and intentional. Eleanor's gaze dropped to it immediately, her expression still, unreadable, but her hands tightened slightly against the table. "That is what you came for," she said quietly. Not a question, just a recognition that had been forming since the moment he spoke of land. Caleb looked at the paper in his hand, then back at her. "Yes," he said, and the word did not carry shame, but it did not hide from it either. It simply stood where it belonged, between them. Eleanor did not reach for it, did not lean closer. She remained exactly where she was, as if any movement would change the balance that had been built over the course of the night. "And now," she said after a moment, "you are deciding what to do with it." Caleb nodded once, slow, steady. "I already did," he replied, and there was not a promise, not a question, but a decision spoken aloud for the first time. Eleanor's eyes lifted from the paper back to his face, searching, measuring, trying to understand whether what he said matched what she had begun to see in him. "Then why are you still holding it?" she asked, and the question hung there, simple, but sharp enough to cut through anything that was not true. Caleb looked down at the paper again, the lantern light catching the crease, the ink faintly visible though unreadable from where she sat. "Because letting go of something like this," he said slowly, "should not be done without knowing exactly what it means." Eleanor leaned back slightly, her gaze never leaving him. "And what does it mean?" she asked, her voice softer now, not pressing, just witnessing. Caleb lifted his eyes to meet hers, and for the first time, there was no distance left. In them, no hesitation, no guarded edge. "It means I do not walk back into that town the same man who walked out of it," he said, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality. Eleanor's breath caught, just slightly, not enough to be heard, but enough to be felt. And in that moment, something shifted, not in the room, not in the night, but in the space between them, something that had been held back finally stepping forward. Then do not, she said, and it was not advice, not permission, just a simple truth offered without expectation. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then down at the paper once more, his fingers tightening slightly around it. Not in hesitation, but an acknowledgement of what it represented outside the first. Faint light of dawn began to press against the horizon, soft and pale, and inside that small house, with the lantern still burning and the last of the storm fading into memory, a man stood at the edge of a decision that would not announce itself with noise or spectacle, but with something quieter, something heavier, something that would only be understood long after it was made. The first light of dawn slipped quietly through the thin edges of the window, pale and uncertain, like it was not yet ready to claim the day. Caleb stood still for a long moment, the folded paper held between his fingers, its weight now heavier than it had been all night, not because it had changed, but because he had. Eleanor did not move, her eyes fixed on him, not urging, not stopping, just bearing witness the way only someone who had lived through enough silence could. Outside, the world was beginning to return, faint sounds of distant movement, a loose shutter tapping somewhere, the low creak of wood waking up after the storm. But inside the house, everything remained suspended, as if time itself had decided to wait for what he would do next. Caleb looked down at the paper again, the edges worn, the ink inside carrying promises that had been written long before this night. Promises made in rooms where decisions were clean and easy because they had not yet been tested. He turned it once in his hand, feeling the crease beneath his thumb, then lifted his gaze to Eleanor. And for the first time, there was something almost like a question in his eyes, not asking her what to do, but asking if she understood what it would cost. Eleanor met that look without hesitation, her expression steady, calm, and in that quiet exchange, something passed between them that did not need words, not agreement, not permission, just recognition. Morning does not wait, she said softly, her voice barely rising above the fading sound of the storm. Caleb gave a small nod. No, he answered, and then, without another word, he stepped toward the stove, each movement deliberate, unhurried, as if he was giving the moment the weight it deserved. The embers still glowed faintly beneath the thin layer of ash, holding just enough heat to matter. Caleb knelt slightly, reaching for a small iron tool to stir them, the ash shifting, revealing a dull red glow beneath. Steady, patient, he paused there, the paper still in his other hand, hovering just above the warmth. Not yet committed. Eleanor watched him closely now, not leaning forward, not pulling back, her breath slow, controlled, as if she knew better than to interrupt something that could not be undone once completed. Caleb's hand tightened slightly around the folded edges, then loosened again, his fingers smoothing the crease. One last time, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the weight behind it. Some things, he said quietly, his eyes still on the paper, are easier to carry when you believe they belong to you. He paused, the faint crackle of the embers filling the space between his words. But that does not make them right. Eleanor did not answer, did not move, but something in her gaze shifted, something softer, something that had not been there before. Caleb exhaled slowly, then lowered the paper just a little closer to the heat, the edge catching the faintest curl. A subtle change, almost invisible at first, then the smallest flicker of smoke rising, thin and hesitant, like it was unsure whether it should exist. He did not pull back, did not hesitate now. The decision already made long before the flame touched it. The paper darkened at the corner, curling inward as the heat took hold, the edges folding into themselves, the ink disappearing not with force, but with a quiet finality that matched the way it had been held. Eleanor's eyes did not leave it, not for a second, watching as the thing that had come to claim her land, her home, her years, slowly turned into something else, something that could no longer be used against her. Caleb released it only when the flame had taken enough of it to ensure it would not return, letting it fall gently into the bed of embers where it finished its quiet transformation. The room filled with the faint scent of burned paper, sharp but fleeting, and then it was gone. Nothing left but ash blending into ash. Caleb remained where he was for a moment longer, staring into the small fire, as if making sure there was nothing left to reconsider. Then he straightened, rising slowly to his feet, his hand now empty, his coat lighter in a way that could not be measured. Eleanor sat very still, her hands resting in her lap now, no longer gripping the table, no longer holding on to something unseen. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried something new, not surprise, not relief, but something deeper, something steadier. "You did not have to do that," she said, and Caleb looked at her, his expression calm, settled. "No," he agreed. And that was all. No explanation, no justification, just the truth as it stood between them. The light outside grew a little stronger, pushing against the edges of the room, the lantern now less necessary than it had been, its flames still burning, but no longer the only source of light. Eleanor's gaze moved from the stove back to Caleb, studying him once more, but this time not as a stranger, not as a man passing through, but as someone who had made a choice that could not be undone. "They will come looking for that," she said after a moment, her voice steady, practical. Caleb nodded slightly. "I know," he replied, and there was no fear in it, no hesitation, just an acceptance of what followed. Eleanor tilted her head just a fraction, her eyes narrowing in a way that suggested she was seeing something she had not expected to find. "And you are still here," she said, and Caleb glanced toward the door, where the first clear line of daylight had begun to form, then back at her. "For now," he answered, and the words held more than they said. Outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving the air clean and sharp, the kind of morning that made everything look clearer than it had the day before. And inside that small house, with the last traces of the night fading into memory, two people stood in the quiet aftermath of a decision that would not be spoken of in the town the same way it was made. Not with laughter, not with certainty, but with something far quieter, something that could only be understood by those who had been there to see it happen. The morning settled fully over the land with a quiet clarity that only comes after a storm has passed. The air outside clean and sharp, carrying the scent of wet earth, and something new beginning, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Caleb stood near the stove for a moment longer, his eyes resting on the last faint traces of ash where the paper had disappeared, not searching for it, not regretting it, just acknowledging that it had once been there, and now it was not. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair, the movement unhurried, deliberate, as if she had learned long ago that rushing a moment only made it harder to understand. She crossed the small space to the window and pushed it open just an inch, letting the cool morning air slip inside, the curtain shifting slightly with the breeze. "It smells different," she said quietly, not turning back to him. Caleb glanced toward the open window, then toward the door, where a thin line of sunlight had begun to stretch across the floorboards. "Storms do that," he replied, and though the words were simple, they carried a meaning that reached beyond the weather. Eleanor nodded faintly, her hand resting lightly against the frame of the window. "They clear what people thought would stay," she said, and for a moment, the room held that truth without needing anything more. Caleb reached for his hat, lifting it from the chair and turning it once in his hands before placing it back on his head. The gesture quiet, familiar, but this time it felt different, like he was putting something back into place after it had shifted. Eleanor turned then, watching him, her expression steady but no longer distant. "You are leaving," she said, not asking, just recognizing the next step in a story that had not yet finished. Caleb met her gaze. "I am stepping outside," he answered, and the distinction was small, but it mattered. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, catching it, understanding it for what it was. Not departure, not yet, just movement. "They will come," she said again, more certain now, as if the daylight itself had confirmed it. Caleb gave a small nod. "They usually do when something they expect is no longer waiting for them," he replied, and there was no bitterness in his voice, no defiance, just a quiet acceptance of the way things worked. Eleanor stepped back from the window, her hands now resting loosely at her sides. "You could still leave before they arrive," she said, and though the words suggested an option, her tone did not push him toward it. Caleb looked toward the door. then back at her, and let them think nothing has changed, he said, and she held his gaze, understanding settling in without needing to be spoken aloud. You believe it has, she said, and Caleb nodded once. It has, he answered, and there was no hesitation left in him now, the uncertainty of the night replaced by something steadier, something that did not need to be proven, only lived. The light outside grew stronger, filling the room in a way the lantern never could, pushing the shadows back into corners where they no longer held the same weight. Eleanor moved to the table, picking up the 2 cups that had long since cooled. Her fingers steady now, no trace of the tension that had been there the night before. People in that town, she said as she carried the cups toward the small basin. They measure change by what they can see. She set the cups down, the soft sound of ceramic against wood marking the moment. And when they do not see it, they pretend it never happened. Caleb listened, his hand resting lightly against the back of the chair where his hat had been. That does not mean it is not real, he said, and Eleanor glanced over her shoulder at him, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. No, she agreed. It just means they will not understand it. The words settled gently, without weight, without expectation. Caleb stepped toward the door then, his boots quiet against the wooden floor, each step measured, not hesitant, but aware. He reached for the handle and paused, just for a moment, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that crossing that threshold would carry everything that had happened inside this house into the world outside. Eleanor watched him, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady. Whatever they say, she said softly, it will not change what you did. Caleb glanced back at her, his expression calm, grounded. No, he said, but it might change what they expect next. And with that, he opened the door, the morning light spilling fully into the room, bright and clear, washing over the space that had held the weight of the night. He stepped out onto the small porch, the wood beneath his boots damp but solid, the air cool against his face, the world stretching out before him in a way that felt both familiar and entirely different. Eleanor remained inside, standing just beyond the threshold, watching as he took that first step into the day, not calling after him, not holding him back, simply allowing the moment to unfold as it would. And out there, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, with the town beginning to stir in the distance and the land stretching wide and unchanged in its silence, Caleb Thorne stood with nothing in his hands. No paper, no claim, no promise except the one he had made without speaking it aloud. And somewhere between the fading echoes of the night and the rising certainty of the morning, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not by words, not by doubt, not by anything that waited beyond that road. The porch boards creaked softly under Caleb's boots as he stepped fully into the morning, the lights stretching across the land in long pale lines that made everything look sharper than it had the night before, as if the storm had stripped away whatever softened the truth. He did not move far, just a few steps from the door, enough to stand where he could see the narrow road leading back toward town, the dirt still dark from the rain, marked only by the faint tracks left before the storm had come through. He rested his hands loosely at his sides, his shoulders relaxed, not waiting in the way a man waits for trouble, but in the way someone stands when they have already accepted what comes next behind him inside the house. Eleanor remained still for a moment longer before stepping closer to the doorway, not crossing it, just standing where the shadow of the frame met the light of the morning, watching him without calling his name, without breaking the quiet that had settled between them. The world beyond the small clearing was beginning to stir, distant movement from the direction of the town, a wagon while turning somewhere far off, the faint echo of voices carried thin across the open space. Not yet clear, but coming closer. Caleb tilted his head slightly, listening, not with urgency, just with awareness. They will not come quietly, Eleanor said from behind him, her voice calm, steady, as if she had said those words before in another life. Caleb did not turn, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. They never do, he replied, and there was no edge to it, no challenge, Just a simple acknowledgement of the way things moved in places like this. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic from the direction of town, the kind of smell that lingered around decisions made in rooms with too many men and not enough patience. Caleb adjusted his stance slightly, one foot settling more firmly into the ground, not bracing, not preparing to fight, just standing in a way that made it clear he was not stepping back. Eleanor's gaze followed him, taking in the way he held himself now, different from the man who had followed her out of the saloon the night before, quieter, steadier, as if something had settled into place that could not be undone. "You could still walk away before they reach this road," she said again, not insisting, not urging, just offering the truth as it existed. Caleb let a small breath leave him, almost a quiet laugh without sound. "I already did," he said, and that answer carried more meaning now than it had before. Eleanor understood it, not because he explained it, but because she had watched him make that choice in the only way that mattered. The sound of hooves reached them then, faint at first, then clearer, a steady rhythm approaching along the road that cut through the open land. Not hurried, not slow, just certain. Caleb did not shift, did not move toward the house or away from it. He remained where he stood, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged. Eleanor stepped just slightly closer to the doorway, still not crossing it, her hands resting lightly against the frame as she watched the horizon. The riders came into view gradually, shapes forming out of the morning light, 3 of them, spaced just enough apart to show they were together without needing to crowd each other. Their silhouettes familiar in the way that people who carry purpose tend to be. Caleb recognized the lead rider even before the details became clear, a man who wore his authority like something borrowed, but never returned, the kind of man who spoke as if decisions had already been made for everyone else. The horses slowed as they approached the edge of the property, the riders taking in the small house, the open door, the man standing out front, and the woman just behind him. None of them spoke at first, the silence stretching between them, not empty, but heavy with expectation. The lead rider finally brought his horse to a stop about 20 feet away, close enough to be heard without raising his voice, far enough to maintain the distance that made things easier to control. His gaze settled on Caleb, measuring, calculating. "You left before we could finish our conversation last night," he said, his tone even, polite in the way that hid what it carried underneath. Caleb did not step forward, did not step back. He simply met the man's gaze. "There was nothing left to finish," he replied, and the words landed quietly, but they did not move. The rider's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in interest, as if something had shifted that he had not expected. "That depends on what you brought with you," the man said, his gaze flicking briefly toward the house behind Caleb, then back. Again, "We were under the impression you had something important to deliver." Caleb's hand remained at his side, empty, relaxed, and that emptiness spoke louder than anything he could have held. "That changed," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no explanation offered, just the truth as it stood. The other riders shifted slightly in their saddles, not restless, just adjusting to a conversation that was no longer moving in the direction they had expected. The lead rider studied Caleb for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then let out a slow breath through his nose. "Things like that do not usually change overnight," he said, and Caleb gave a small nod. "No," he agreed, "but sometimes people do," and that was where it settled, not in confrontation, not in raised voices or sudden movement, but in something far quieter, something that could not be undone by force or argument, just by the simple fact that it had already happened. The man on the horse looked past Caleb then, his gaze finding Eleanor in the doorway, his eyes lingering there for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring her place in all of this, then returning to Caleb. "You are choosing a difficult road," he said, and for the first time, there was something almost like warning in his voice, not threat, just recognition of what came next. Caleb did not look away, did not shift his stance. "It is the only one left," he answered, and the morning air held that exchange, quiet and clear, as the sun continued to rise, casting longer shadows behind them all. And in that moment, with the land still damp from the storm, and the future standing just beyond the edge of what could be seen, The difference between what was expected and what had been chosen became something that no one there could ignore, even if they did not yet know what to do with it. The silence that followed did not break. It settled, deeper than before, as if the land itself had leaned in to hear what would happen next. The lead rider shifted slightly in his saddle, the leather creaking under his weight, his eyes still fixed on Caleb, measuring not just the man but the space he now occupied, a space that had changed without permission. You understand what happens when expectations are not met, the rider said after a moment, his tone still calm, but firmer now, like a man reminding rather than warning. Caleb did not move, his hands still empty at his sides, his stance unchanged. "I do," he replied, and there was no edge in it, no resistance, just a quiet acknowledgement that did not bend. The other two riders exchanged brief glances, subtle, practiced, the kind that said more than words without needing to be noticed. Eleanor remained in the doorway, her presence steady behind him, not stepping forward, not retreating, simply standing where she had chosen to stand, the morning light catching the edges of her figure, outlining her against the darker interior of the house. The lead rider's gaze flicked toward her again, then back to Caleb. "This was never personal," he said, as if offering something that might still be accepted. Caleb gave a small nod. "That is what makes it easier," he answered, and the words carried a meaning that settled heavier than they sounded. The rider's expression tightened just slightly, not anger, not frustration, just the realization that something had shifted beyond his reach. "And yet you made it so," he said, and Caleb let a slow breath leave him. "No," he replied. "It was always that way. I just did not see it until now." The wind moved lightly across the open land, carrying the last traces of the storm away, the world returning to its usual rhythm. But something about it felt different, clearer, like the lines between things had been redrawn in a way that could not be ignored. The lead rider leaned forward just slightly in his saddle, his voice lowering, not to hide, but to narrow the space between them. "Men do not often walk away from opportunities like this," he said, "not without reason." Caleb met his gaze without hesitation. "Then I suppose I finally found one," he answered, and there it was again. Not defiance, not challenge, just a simple truth that did not need to be proven. The rider studied him for a long moment, longer than before, as if searching for something that might still be turned, still be shaped into what had been expected. But whatever he was looking for, he did not find it. He straightened slowly, his posture settling back into something more formal, more distant. "You leave us with a problem," he said, and though the words carried weight, they did not press forward. They simply stated what was already known. Caleb nodded once. "I know," he replied, and there was no apology in it, no attempt to soften what had been done, just the acceptance of consequence that came with the decision. The other riders shifted again, their horses stepping lightly against the damp ground, restless not with urgency, but with the awareness that something had concluded without resolution. The lead rider let his gaze drift once, more toward Eleanor, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in threat, but in calculation, as if measuring what remained now that what had been expected was gone. Then he looked back at Caleb. "This does not end here," he said, and the statement hung in the air, not as a promise of action, but as a recognition of what had been set in motion. Caleb gave a small nod. "Most things do not," he answered, and the calm in his voice carried farther than any raised tone could have. The rider held his gaze for one last moment, then gave a slight pull on the reins, his horse responding immediately, stepping back, turning just enough to signal the end of the exchange. The other two followed without needing instruction, their movements coordinated in a way that spoke of habit, of decisions made. Long before this one, the sound of hooves shifted direction, no longer approaching, now moving away, steady and controlled. The dust still damp beneath them, rising only slightly with each step. Caleb did not turn to watch them leave. Not immediately. He remained where he was, facing the road ahead as if the moment was not yet finished, as if something still needed to settle before it could be considered complete behind him. Eleanor stepped just slightly closer to the doorway, her presence now nearer, though still not crossing the threshold. They will return, she said quietly, not with fear, not with certainty, just with the understanding of how things moved in places like this. Caleb finally turned his head just enough to glance back toward her, his expression unchanged, steady. Maybe, he said, and the word held more than it suggested. Not doubt, not dismissal, just the acknowledgement that what came next would not be shaped by expectation alone. Eleanor studied him for a moment, longer, then let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing in a way that had not been possible before. You could still leave before that happens, she added, and though the words echoed what she had said before, they carried less weight now, less urgency, as if she already knew the answer. Caleb looked out across the land again, the morning fully awake now, the sky clear, the road stretching out in both directions. I could, he agreed, and then, after a pause that held the weight of everything that had passed, but I will not. And that was all. No explanation, no defense, just the truth standing where it belonged. Eleanor nodded once, slowly, as if accepting not just his words, but what they meant for everything that would follow. The last sound of the riders faded into the distance, swallowed by the open land. And in their absence, the quiet returned. Not the same quiet as before, but something steadier, something that held the shape of what had just happened without needing to fill it. Caleb stood there a moment longer, then stepped down from the porch, his boots meeting the damp ground with a soft, certain sound, not moving away from the house, not toward the road, just stepping into the space between, as if choosing to stand exactly where he was. And in that space, with the morning fully risen and the past already set behind him, the path ahead no longer looked like something waiting to be taken, but something that would be made one step at a time. The quiet that followed the rider's departure did not feel empty. It felt earned, like something that had been waiting beneath the surface of the land for a long time and had finally been allowed to settle into place. Caleb stood in the yard with the morning light stretching across his shoulders, the damp ground firm beneath his boots, and for the first time since the night began, there was nothing pressing against him. No expectation hanging in the air, no decision waiting to be made, only the weight of what had already been chosen. Behind him, Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking softly beneath her as she crossed the threshold she had held all morning, not rushing, not hesitating, simply moving forward as if the line between inside and outside no longer held the same meaning it once did. She stopped a few feet behind him, close enough to share the same space, far enough to leave it his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the breeze moving gently across the open land, carrying with it the faint sounds of the town beginning its day, distant voices, the soft clatter of something being moved, the rhythm of life returning to its usual pace. They will talk about this, Eleanor said at last, her voice calm, almost thoughtful. Caleb let a small breath leave him, his gaze still fixed on the road ahead. They always do, he replied, and there was no weight in it now, no concern, just the acceptance of something that no longer mattered the way it once might have. Eleanor took a step closer, her boots pressing lightly into the damp earth, leaving faint marks that would fade by afternoon. They will say you lost something, she continued, her eyes following the same road he had been watching. Caleb tilted his head slightly, considering the words without rejecting them. Maybe I did, he said, and there was no resistance in the admission, no attempt to reshape it into something else. Eleanor glanced at him then, studying the calm in his expression, the absence of doubt. And you're not troubled by that? She asked, not challenging, just seeking to understand. Caleb finally shifted his gaze, turning just enough to look at her, the morning light catching in his eyes in a way that made them seem clearer, steadier than before. No, he said, because I know what I did not lose. And that was where it rested. Simple, quiet, but complete. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, slowly, as if something inside her had settled into place as well. That is not something many people can say, she replied, and there was no judgment in it, only recognition. Caleb gave a small nod in return, then looked back toward the open land, the horizon stretching out in a way that no longer felt like something distant, but something present, something reachable. What will you do now? Eleanor asked after a while, Her voice softer, less guarded than it had been the night before. Caleb did not answer immediately, his eyes tracing the line where the road disappeared into the distance, then shifting to the house behind him, then back again. "I will stay for a while," he said finally, and the words carried no weight of obligation, no sense of being tied down, just a choice made in the same quiet way as the one before it. Eleanor's brows lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in consideration. "This place does not offer much," she said, and Caleb let out a faint breath that might have been the beginning of a smile. "It offers enough," he answered, and again, there was no need to explain it further, the meaning already clear in the way he stood, the way he had chosen. Eleanor turned her gaze toward the house, taking in the worn boards, the small window, the roof that still held traces of the storm. "It has been a long time since anyone has chosen to stay here," she said quietly, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before, something lighter, not hope exactly, but something close enough to it to be noticed. Caleb followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "Then maybe it is time someone did," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any promise could have. The breeze shifted again, moving through the open space between them, carrying away the last traces of the storm, leaving only the clarity of the morning. Behind, Eleanor stepped forward once more, closing the small distance between them until she stood beside him. Not behind, not separate, but equal in the space they shared, her shoulders straight, her posture no longer carrying the quiet burden it had held for so many years. And for a moment, they both stood there, looking out across the land that had been fought over in ways that never needed to be spoken, that had been measured and valued by people who had never truly seen it, and yet remained unchanged in the ways that mattered most. "They will not understand this," she said after a while, her voice steady, almost certain. Caleb nodded. "No," he agreed, "but they do not have to." And that was enough, the answer settling into the space between them with a quiet certainty that did not need to be defended. The sun rose a little higher, the light growing stronger, stretching farther across the ground, filling in the shadows that had lingered from the night before. And in that light, with nothing left hidden and nothing left to decide, the world did not feel smaller or more limited, but wider, as if something had opened rather than closed. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, his stance relaxed but firm, his presence no longer that of a man passing through, but of someone who had chosen where he stood, and Eleanor, standing beside him, no longer felt like someone waiting to be left behind, but like someone who had been seen, not for what she had lost, but for what she had held on to. And in that shared silence, with the morning fully awake and the road stretching out ahead without promise or demand, the story that had brought them to this point did not end. It simply changed direction, quietly, without announcement, into something neither of them had expected. But both had chosen all the same. The sun climbed higher, slow and certain, casting long shadows that began to shorten with each passing minute, and the land, still damp from the storm, seemed to breathe under the warmth of the light. Caleb remained where he stood for a while longer, not out of hesitation, but because there was no need to move yet, no urgency pressing against him the way it had the day before. Eleanor stood beside him, her presence no longer distant or guarded, but steady, grounded in the same quiet, understanding that had settled between them. "They will send someone else," she said after a time, her voice calm, not weighed down by worry, just shaped by experience. Caleb nodded slightly, his gaze still fixed on the road that stretched beyond what could be seen. "Maybe," he replied, and the word carried neither doubt nor certainty, only the recognition that the future did not need to be decided all at once. Eleanor turned her head just enough to study him again, not searching this time, but observing, as if she had already found what she needed to see. "You speak like a man who has stopped measuring what comes next," she said, and there was a quiet understanding in her tone. Caleb let out a small breath, something close to a thoughtful pause. "I think I spent too long measuring the wrong things," he answered, and that was all. No explanation, no defense, just a truth that had finally settled into place. Eleanor's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but something softer, something that had not been there before. "That happens," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, only the weight of years that had already been carried. The wind moved gently through the open space, lifting the edges of her shawl, carrying the scent of the morning further across the land. The house behind them stood quiet, unchanged in its shape, but different now in a way that could not be seen from the outside. Caleb shifted his stance slightly, turning just enough to look at the structure, taking in the worn boards, the slight tilt of the porch, the window that still held traces of the night's condensation. "There is work to be done here," he said, not as an observation, but as a simple acknowledgement of what existed. Eleanor followed his gaze, her eyes moving across the same detail she had known for years. "There always has been," she replied, and there was a quiet strength in her voice, not resignation, not complaint, just the truth as it had always been. Caleb nodded once, then took a step forward, moving toward the fence that lined the edge of the property, the wood damp but solid beneath his hand as he rested it lightly against one of the posts. He did not test it, did not try to fix it yet, just felt it grounding himself in something real, something that did not shift with words or expectation. Eleanor watched him, her gaze steady, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been the day before. "You do not have to take on what is mine," she said. And though the words could have been a warning, they were not. They were simply a boundary offered with clarity. Caleb glanced back at her, his expression calm. "I am not taking it," he said. "I am standing near it." And the distinction mattered, not just in what he said, but in the way he said it. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, accepting the difference without needing it to be explained further. "Standing near something long enough has a way of changing it," she said quietly, and Caleb let out a faint breath. "Or changing the person standing there," he replied, and again, there was no argument, only a shared understanding that both could be true. The town in the distance had fully awakened now, faint movements visible along the edge of the horizon, wagons beginning their slow paths, figures moving between buildings, the rhythm of a place returning to its routine, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, that something had shifted just beyond its reach. Eleanor turned her gaze toward that distant movement, her eyes narrowing slightly as if measuring something she had seen many times before. "They will go on as if nothing happened," she said, and there was no disappointment in it, only certainty. Caleb followed her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the land closer to them, the fence, the ground, the house. "That is because nothing happened to them," he said, and the words settled simply, without judgment. Eleanor let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing as she turned back toward him. "And here," she asked, her voice softer now, "what do you think happened here?" Caleb did not answer immediately, his eyes moving once more across the space, taking in the details not as a stranger, but as someone who had already begun to belong to it in a quiet, unspoken way. "A decision," he said finally, "one that does not need to be explained." And Eleanor's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she nodded, a small, steady movement that carried more agreement than any words could have. The light continued to grow stronger, filling in the last shadows, warming the ground, drying the traces of the storm, and with it, the sense of something beginning, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the same quiet way everything else had unfolded. Caleb straightened slightly, his hand leaving the fence post as he turned back toward the house, taking a few slow steps, not rushed, not uncertain, simply moving with the understanding that he was no longer passing through. Eleanor stepped aside just enough to allow him space as he approached, not yielding, not stepping back, but adjusting, the kind of movement that spoke of shared space rather than claimed territory. "There's coffee left from yesterday," she said as he reached the porch, her voice carrying a note of something lighter, something that had not been there before. Caleb glanced at her, then toward the door. "Then we should not let it go to waste," he replied, and there was a faint warmth in his tone, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel. Eleanor turned toward the doorway, stepping inside with a quiet certainty, and Caleb followed a moment later, crossing the threshold not as a stranger seeking shelter from a storm, but as someone who had already chosen to stay through what came after it. And outside, the land remained as it had always been, wide, open, indifferent to the small decisions that shaped the lives within it. And yet, in that quiet morning light, something had changed in a way that would not be measured by those who had not been there to see it, but would remain all the same, steady and certain, in the space it now occupied. The house held the quiet of morning in a different way than it had held the silence of night, lighter. Now, less burdened, as if the walls themselves had shifted along with the people inside them. Caleb stood near the small stove while Eleanor poured what remained of the coffee into 2 cups, the liquid dark and slightly bitter from sitting too long, but still warm enough to matter. She handed one to him without ceremony, without hesitation, and he took it the same way, their fingers not touching, but the space between them no longer carrying distance. They did not sit right away, instead, standing there for a moment, each holding the cup as if it anchored them to something real, something steady. "It will not be quiet for long," Eleanor said, her voice calm, not as a warning, but as a simple understanding of how things move beyond these walls. Caleb nodded slightly, lifting the cup to take a slow sip, the taste grounding, familiar in a way that did not belong to any one place. "It does not need to be," he replied, setting the cup down on the table with care, the sound soft but certain. Eleanor watched him, her eyes no longer searching for what he might do, but observing what he already had. "You chose a path without knowing where it leads," she said, and there was no doubt in her tone, only recognition. Caleb leaned lightly against the edge of the table, his posture relaxed in a way that had not been possible before. "No," he answered, "I chose a direction," and the distinction settled into the room. Quiet but clear, Eleanor allowed herself a small nod, her gaze dropping briefly to the table, then lifting again. "That is enough," she said, and there was something in her voice now that carried a quiet certainty, not about the future, but about the present, about the fact that something had already been decided, and that was what mattered. The light through the window grew stronger, filling the room fully now, leaving no corners untouched. The lantern still burned, but its glow was no longer needed, its flame small against the strength of the day. Caleb glanced toward it, then reached out and turned the wick down slowly until the light faded, not extinguished, just resting, waiting. Eleanor noticed the gesture, the way he chose not to put it out completely, and something in her expression softened further. "You leave things ready to be used." "Again," she said quietly. Caleb gave a faint shrug. "Some things deserve another night," he replied, and she understood what he meant without needing him to say more. Outside, the sounds of the day grew clearer, the distant rhythm of the town continuing as if nothing had changed, as if the night had not existed for anyone beyond this small house. Eleanor moved to the doorway, resting her hand lightly against the frame as she looked out across the land once more, the same land that had been measured, valued, contested, and yet remained exactly what it had always been. She stood there for a moment, then spoke without turning. "They will come again, and when they do, they will expect something from you." Caleb stepped closer, not beside her, but near enough to share the same view. "They will expect me to return to what I was," he said, and there was no tension in his voice, no resistance, just the acknowledgement of something that no longer held power over him. Eleanor nodded slowly. "And you will not," she said, not asking, not doubting, just stating what she already knew. Caleb looked out across the horizon, the road stretching far beyond where it could be followed. "No," he answered, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else he could have said. The wind moved lightly through the open doorway, brushing past them both, carrying with it the quiet certainty of a day that would not ask permission before unfolding. Eleanor stepped back slightly, turning to face him, her eyes steady, her posture straight, but no longer guarded. "Then this place will change," she said, and there was no fear in it, no hesitation, just the recognition that change was not always something to resist. Caleb met her gaze, holding it for a moment longer than before. "It already has," he replied, and that was where it settled, not in what would come next, not in what others would say or do, but in what had already been set in motion. The two of them stood there for a while longer, not speaking, not needing to, the quiet between them no longer heavy, no longer filled with uncertainty, but steady, grounded, The kind of quiet that comes when something has been decided without needing to be declared outside. The sun climbed higher, the land drying beneath it. The traces of the storm fading into memory. And inside, the small house held the warmth of something new. Not loud, not dramatic, but real in a way that did not require acknowledgement from anyone else. Caleb finally stepped past her, moving out onto the porch once more, his boots finding the same place they had earlier, but this time with a different weight, not of hesitation, but of presence. Eleanor remained in the doorway, watching him, not as someone waiting for him to leave, but as someone who understood that staying was no longer something that needed to be asked. And in that quiet morning, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to explain, the story did not end with a declaration or a farewell. It remained there, in the space between them, in the land that stretched beyond, in the choice that had been made without witness or reward, and in the simple truth that sometimes the loudest thing a person can do is stay where they once intended to leave.